across disciplines so that you're getting a much more blended view of what is this ecosystem and where does it need to go and how are we going to get there. You can't have those discussions well until you have a shared vocabulary and until you appreciate and understand different perspectives of the other stakeholders and the groups they represent. You need those.
All right, welcome to the Actionable ESG Talk series brought to you by AKFI Actionable Knowledge Foundational Institute, the world's first nonprofit industry consortium committed to bridging the gap between ESG, sustainability, and digital transformation. My name is Isabella. I am the co-host of this talk series, here with another awesome co-host, Manuel, and our special guest today, Jennifer. Hello, Jennifer.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here. Jennifer is a PhD and she's a co-founder and CEO of the company called ESG.AI, a platform that combines machine learning and natural language processing NLP to provide companies with insights into their ESG performance. And Jennifer is an adjunct professor in system design engineering at the University of Waterloo. And she's also the co-founder of the concept of zero effort technology, and it's spearheading the ethical by design framework for supporting collaborative development of responsible technologies. And Jennifer has given keynote presentation at several international conferences, and it's a board member on leading organizations and journals. And she has authored over 100 peer-reviewed publications. And she's here today now with us on the Actionable ESG Talk series by AKFI, and to share everything she has to offer today. Super excited. Thank you so much again. And why don't you start with the question on what are your thoughts on current state of the sustainability, ESG, and digital transformation trends?
Okay, so wow, that's an enormous, question.
We get that many times.
I know, that's so huge. I mean, I think that question cuts to the heart of a lot of what's going on right now in the space. First off is the question of sustainability. That's the word that really jumps out to me. There is understanding what do we mean when we say sustainable. You know, there's the concept of ESG and how a lot of people are using it as a way to help companies and the world in general achieve a more sustainable ecosystem, way of doing business, etc. But there's also the concept of sustainability of ESG concepts themselves. And I think a lot to do with sustainability has to do with value. We have to create systems that have value to the people who are using them in order for them to be sustainable. And we also need systems that are able to dynamically adapt and grow to the changing landscape and ecosystem of ESG. ESG is such a new field, and we all know it's a bit chaotic right now because it is so new and it is so complex. So we're really exploring right now, what can we do with ESG? You know, we're sort of at the birth of what do we do with ESG? And very importantly, how do we integrate concepts related to ESG in a way that makes sense and adds value to many stakeholders who need to use the concepts. So while if it only creates value for certain pockets of individuals, then it's not a sustainable concept, because then you have a whole bunch of others who are like, I don't understand why this is a big deal. Why should I care about this? Or even in some cases, this is damaging to me, which it may be, but we have to work through those things. So I think sustainability at its core, it needs to also be able to adapt and evolve to match and to complement the changing landscape of ESG and of technologies that are then there to help us navigate. What I think is really, very interesting and a real challenge for us to look at is that technology at the same time is very dynamic right now. Looking at the evolution, for example, AI, ChatGPT, ChatGPT 3, ChatGPT 4, and it's just exponentially ramping up as are other technologies in terms of what we can do with them is becoming more and more powerful. But a lot of them are still in their infancy too. So I find this one piece to me is very fascinating. It presents a tremendous potential, but also something we need to think very carefully about. These two fields are colliding. The use of a lot of integrated high-tech technology that we have little expertise with in terms of what can we do with it and what are potential pitfalls we need to be aware of. And we also have ESG also growing very, very rapidly. And we're not sure what we're doing with that or how, and they're both evolving sort of together as well as side by side. So I think when it comes to the whole question of sustainability, we need to think carefully, very carefully, and do a lot of testing. We need a lot of brave spaces where we can try out ideas with respect to technology and ESG to figure out how do we blend the two and use them to kind of one-up each other in a positive way where we have value to multiple stakeholders who are involved in the ecosystem.
Thank you, Jen. And before we moving actually to a next substantial question, you use a term that sort of triggered an image, which is you said the the fields of technology and human knowledge and our abilities are colliding, and you sort of I was thinking of ChatGPT as a car without brakes. So we need to build brakes as well. We have accelerator. Clearly, you said, GPT 3, 4, 5, 6.5, whatever will come next. But we need to figure out how we also channel this energy into useful projects. And of course, we need both acceleration and brakes so we can steer the technology to a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think, it's the conversation is so often on should we X, Y, Z, where I think a lot of the conversation needs to shift much more to the how do we, because once the tool is built, it's going to be used. It doesn't mean that the tool itself is bad. It doesn't mean we shouldn't use higher technology in these cases. Indeed, in a lot of cases, they're very powerful. And I'd argue you can't do ESG until very recently. One of the reasons ESG has stagnated somewhat is just the data that is required to push that model through and to get it working is so immense. It's not possible to do until recently with the type of technologies that have evolved, especially when you think about things like emissions monitoring, for example. A lot of that is not really possible until the last few years in terms of sensors and data streaming and just the enormous amount of data processing and everything else. So it's like any other piece of technology. It's not the technology itself that is good or bad. It is what we do with it and how we use it. And that how question, we need to spend a lot more time on the how question. Not just how do we leverage this, but how do we react if we have unintended consequences, and how do we check that things are happening the way we think they're happening. Something that becomes more concerning as well, where you have more automated systems of technologies talking to technologies. How are we going to have oversight and make sure they're communicating data and processing data in a way that makes sense and is correct for what we're trying to do with it. And that it becomes much more difficult when you have very large data sets being processed very quickly. It's a hard problem.
Clearly, and again, we'll move very soon to next question on this multidisciplinary and how to build the right experts. But before going there, AKFI is actually working on a white paper on the supply chain and the gap in the supply chain requirements. We found out that, and we talked, I think, before the call, for instance, in the mining industry, or that I know your company is working on data sets, but also on supply chains practically for any industry. The flowing of data still has to be aligned, and again, the technology has to get shared downstream from the large company to the small and medium companies that have to report. Carbon footprint will be one first example. Scope 3 emissions involve the whole supply chain, and the supply chains are very long, very complex, and definitely technologically not uniform, right? The big companies invested in digital transformation. They have the skills, the people, the culture. The smaller companies don't.
Yes. And then there's so many aspects. That's such a loaded, and it's a beautiful example is monitoring scope and supply chain. I think there's the inequity between what big companies are capable of versus small. Big companies have their challenges too, in terms of they're more likely to be global. So they're operating in a lot of different regions, a lot of different, many multinationals also are operating in different sectors. So they have that challenge too, of just the enormity of what they need to report on, which small companies don't. But on the other hand, small companies don't necessarily have resources to throw at the problem. Another one where we need to be really innovative, it's quite exciting, frankly, is E tends, and we've heard this many places before, this is not a new idea, but E tends to be more technological friendly because it's more quantifiable on average. So we still have technology that is better able to handle numbers. It's easier in a lot of the systems and types of tech we built when you're talking about numbers. When you look at things like F, and you're looking at how do we measure, how do we, I don't want to say quantify, because you don't necessarily have to quantify S, and that's why it's such a slippery fish, is how do we get at S in terms of what are meaningful targets or meaningful measures within S, and then S as well is more prone to values. So what might constitute an acceptable S in a certain geographical region or culture, for example, or even discipline, might look quite different somewhere else. Whereas tons of CO2 is tons of CO2. It doesn't matter what country you're in, that's a much more quantified and less abstract area. So even when you get to questions of supply chain, something like tons of CO2, difficult if you're a massive multinational, but technically possible. S becomes, to me, that's a really interesting spot to see how that's going to really play out in terms of supply chain S. Who's judging the goodness of S, and what's value of S, and what are the thresholds of S are when you think about all the different all the different aspects of it. So you brought up mining.
S ties into cultures and ties into ethics of different, ties into the legal and the systems, and of course laws of different countries, different regions are different. We see this, for instance, with European Community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. A great example from, you mentioned mining. They've honestly been doing a lot of quite innovative and interesting work around the S piece, because they do often work closely with indigenous peoples in many different cultures, and they're also multinational. So they've had to think about that sort of S aspect, and how are they going to approach it? How are they going to handle that? How are they going to report what they're doing with respect to S to their stakeholders? Um, so there's interesting lessons there. Another interesting example actually is in some of the ESG models. One of the metrics people look at is whether a company has an anti-child labor policy, for example. And you go to our clients who are in North America, Europe, a lot of them have a 0 score in that, because that's not something they report on necessarily. Because of course, of course we don't have, 0 tolerance for child labor. But again, it's such a loaded thing when you stop and think about it. For North America and Europe, they don't even bother reporting, because of course they don't, right? But as soon as you look at supply chain, it changes quite a lot. It depends on, what's your business. And most of us are aware about things like conflict minerals, for example. And then how does that play out then when you start looking beyond just, corporate horizons? Where do your responsibilities begin and end? So there's all sorts of really interesting things like this that, ESG is starting, for those who are open to it and sort of leaning in a bit. It starts really raising questions like this that, if we go at it correctly, I think could really change how we define the way we categorize businesses. But it's going to take time. It's going to take time and a lot of experimentation. And honestly, this is the thing I'm very curious about. Are we going to allow people brave spaces where they're permitted to try things and fail? Because not everything we're going to try is going to work. But we have to try different things to figure out what will work, and how do we support each other around failures so that people feel confident enough to try new and innovative things in this space. I'm curious as to how we're going to handle that.
Definitely will be a slow process. And I'll move to the next question, but and that focuses on how we educate people. How can we educate people in such a way that they are able to cope, able to process this kind of information? We are super specialized these days. I graduated in engineering, for instance, and I don't remember any course on ethics of what I'm doing as an engineer. Nor it's brought into discussions. I was watching recently 3 hours interview with the ChatGPT CEO, and the word ethics was not uttered. It was not part of the discussion on the impact. There were a lot of things about the technologies, the challenges, and very little about humans, the users. So how we bring? I know you introduced and you wrote research papers on transdisciplinary, and I'm curious to see how you separate. We hear multidisciplinary, we hear specialization. What is transdisciplinary, and why we should direct our education toward this kind of approach?
Great question. Obviously, I'm highly biased, but I think that this is something we need to do. And And I want to put the caveat right at the start is you don't need to do transdisciplinary for everything. It's right tool for the job. In the case of ESG systems, I think we need a lot more transdisciplinarity as it's a complex space. So the more complex the space, the more transdisciplinarity, there needs to be a presence of transdisciplinarity, meaning disciplines working together to create new knowledge. So, like you say, there's multidiscipline, cross-discipline, all these terms around, and they're all defined slightly differently. The way I think about them is multidisciplinary is when you have people from different disciplines working together on something that there's not a whole lot of knowledge exchange. So they're adding knowledge to a project or something thereabouts, but they're kind of pushing knowledge. When it's more cross-disciplinary, then you're starting to get knowledge crossing. So you're pushing knowledge, but you're also pulling knowledge back and learning from other disciplines so that you're still very discipline centric in your view, but you're also appreciating other disciplines' point of views and you're working together to kind of find that sweet spot. Transdisciplinary, which I really think of more as an ideal rather than something necessarily always achievable, is when you have knowledge and then you're creating a new discipline or a new way of doing things and thinking about things where everyone comes from different angles, but then they start to kind of blend and merge their knowledge because they're working so closely on an idea or a project. And in transdisciplinarity, a key piece that really needs to happen a lot more in the ESG and tech space is this ability to crosstalk among the disciplines. Right now, it's very siloed still, where different disciplines are coming at the ESG space with their background, their knowledge, their needs, their agendas, and trying to figure out how do I fit in and how do I get what I need out of this space, which is reasonable. And especially because the space is younger and less well defined, that's a natural starting point. There is very little sort of ESG experts, considering the enormous impact ESG is starting to have. There's very few people who are specifically trained in ESG, but there's people from many different disciplines with an interest in it. So as we go, something that's very important and needs to be done better is talking across disciplines and having knowledge exchange across disciplines so that you're getting a much more blended view of what is this ecosystem and where does it need to go and how are we going to get there. You can't have those discussions well until you have a shared vocabulary and until you appreciate and understand different perspectives of the other stakeholders and the groups they represent. You need those translators between different ideas to start talking so that then you get really interesting solutions and systems and uses of technology where it's not simply having the blinders on. That's where we run into so much trouble with technology, is when we go at it really hard from one angle and we're oblivious to how it's impacting other parts of the system or other types of people. That's when we get into trouble. But we can't see, like, we can't take the blinders off until we can see, we don't know what we don't know, basically. And a lot of that we can't know until we really harness and really listen to each other and find middle grounds, which is very difficult in an ecosystem that's as complex, as messy, and moving as fast as ESG and technology is. It's definitely a tall challenge, but something that must happen if we're going to pull this off well.
Actually, you brought a very, very interesting points, but I'm sure all of us sat in meetings where specialists all excel in using acronyms and an abstract language that almost to make sure that nobody else understands the expertise. And I think that's coming. It's a human characteristics. I know. Isabella studied, the digital mind of tomorrow, which I think we need to change the title. It should be the digital mind of today with ChatGPT. And
That's a great idea. The next book is called The Digital Mind of Today. So tomorrow is here.
Came faster than we all predicted, I guess.
Yes, it only take the time of one book from tomorrow to today.